Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss whether Kamala is the return of Hillary Clinton, unrest in Venezuela, and the rise of white affinity groups in politics. I'm joined by Sohrab, Ahmari, and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. Will Kamala be Hillary 2.0? That's the question asked by Matt Stoller in a piece published this week at compactmag.com. In the piece, Stoller, who is an advocate of antitrust policies, notes that Kamala has attracted support from the Silicon Valley mega donor, Reid Hoffman. He's already splurged $7 million on a Biden-Harris super PAC, and he's asking for just two small things in return for all his generosity. One is removing Lina Khan, the Federal Trade Commission chairwoman who has pushed Biden's antitrust policies. And the other small ask is a removal of all the Trump era tariffs that were extended under Joe Biden. So, Rob, what are the risks facing Kamala if she does this? And how does it make her more like Hillary?
Well, the risks are the fact that in the United States, elections are won at the margins, and they are won at the margins in really just a few deindustrialized states in the Rust Belt, in the Midwest. And in those places, I will now set aside the con issue, but I think the more important one is the tariffs one. In those places, tariffs are very popular. Already, union households, beginning in 2016, had started to, in these battleground states, had started to shift toward the Republican Party remarkably, because the Republican Party had become the party of Trump and the party of tariffs. In a way, a return to form for the Republican Party of old, of the 19th century and early 20th century. So, the appeal of tariffs as a way to defeat, for example, Chinese attempts to flood the U.S. Auto market with electric vehicles is very strong in places like that. And it's not just the direct auto workers, but the various subsidiary industries that feed into the U.S. auto industry that would be affected by this as well. So it's a pretty dangerous ask. And then on the antitrust front, I don't know if that's so much at the forefront of voters' minds when they think about the economic issues and Bidenism. But there are various ways in which consolidation and trust-like practices make American lives needlessly difficult and expensive. For example, there are these intermediaries in the pharmaceutical industry that really they've just placed themselves as a kind of choke point between pharmacists and consumers, and they just extract rents. And Lina Khan has aggressively gone after these types of choke points, these rentiers. And that's a good message for Team Biden to tout as they go into the election. So Lina Khan can be an electoral asset. So in both of those cases, there is a danger. Stoller is a Democrat, and obviously he's writing as a kind of concerned Democrat. There's a danger of a reversion to Clintonian technocracy, which is very close to Wall Street, which was very close to big tech, and promised mainly cultural progressivism, but not much on political economy to working and lower middle class Americans, the type of people who determine elections, especially in those battleground states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And that's, for Stoller, it's a risk. Now we can talk about, maybe someone else should talk about his point that is the Trump campaign capitalizing enough on these facts?
I had a thought yesterday, which was that, what you see is, I haven't done a thorough survey, but it would seem a lot of the messaging from the Trump camp and adjacent sort of influencers and so on is really hammering away at Kamala's most sort of left wing statements that she made, for example, as a candidate in the Democratic primary in 2020, when as Zed Jelani covered for us, she kind of attempted to cater to the progressive wing that was largely being competed for between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. She sort of tried to appeal to that end of the electorate, but at the same time, sort of also tried to appeal to the kind of centrist Clintonian wing, and the result was a complete mess. But nevertheless, what you see from the Republicans, it would seem, is just kind of highlighting these statements she made when she was essentially trying to pander to the most kind of left wing, and particularly sort of identitarian left wing, sort of defund the police, etc., end of the Democratic electorate, even though she never really did so in a particularly consistent way or one that suggested any strong conviction, as Jelani wrote for us. So I think the weakness of this approach, it strikes me, from the Trump camp, and then I'll get to your question, Sohrab, is that it's very reminiscent of a playbook that was tried twice against Obama, who had many of the same vulnerabilities. Had this sort of exotic name, had a sort of academic intellectual family with sort of left wing connections. Uh, had sort of been could be connected to all of these sort of farther left ideas. Of course, the Republicans ran with this, with the Kenyan anti-colonialist, blah 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 sort of narrative, and it was a complete failure. It didn't work at all, right? Um, and in fact, what landed far more effectively was in 2012, which should have been a pretty closely contested election given the state of the economy, uh, was a sort of anti plutocrat message that the Obama camp waged relentlessly against the Romney Ryan campaign. Right, that they tagged Romney as a fat cat, as a plutocrat, as somebody who doesn't care about ordinary people, and so on. And that was quite effective, much more so than these attempts to flag Obama as some kind of outside of the mainstream radical, which interestingly, I think uh, were then sort of a preview of what the Democrats' attempts against Trump would be, right? To paint him as an outside of the mainstream extremist, radical, fascist, blah, blah, blah. Obama is a communist, Trump is a fascist, same basic kind of ideas, trying to tar a candidate as falling outside of the American political mainstream. Seems to be what the right is trying to do with Kamala now. The thing is that whether it was tried by the Republicans against Obama or the Democrats against Trump, it wasn't a particularly effective line of argument. And so I think, and as Stoller, I think, suggests in the piece, and it kind of goes back to a piece we published a few weeks ago about Steve Bannon's imprisonment. It would seem that the marginalization of the sort of Bannonite populist camp within MAGA world is perhaps showing in a sort of relative distance from the sort of messages that were used very effectively against Hillary Clinton in 2016, right? Which, painting her not as a radical student of Saul Alinsky, blah, 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 but as a sort of insider fat cat, getting paid for speeches, $500,000 for speeches at Goldman Sachs, and basically a kind of out of touch elite establishment person. And so I think it's it's probably too early to tell, but it would seem telling to me that the GOP may be leaning back into this strategy with Obama, which I think probably claiming somebody with a long career as a pretty, for the most part, sort of establishment, relatively centrist Democrat, is a communist who's going to subvert the nation's institutions and so on, is just not a regardless of what you think of the the truths that might be contained within that message, even if hyperbolically, it doesn't seem to be particularly effective, regardless of who uses it. And it's notable to me that that's what's being deployed here, as opposed to the more 2016 playbook of just hammering away at the establishment and various kinds of populist themes. So it's interesting to see this kind of playing out, as Stoller argues, kind of on both sides, in terms of both of them potentially leaning away from what could be relatively potent sort of populist messaging.
It's interesting to see, and we've talked before about Kamala's change in political views in different periods in her career, and I think that is one difficulty with presenting her as a leftist or hardcore liberal. She's gone back and forth on various issues, and above all, seems to just be highly responsive to the demands of the moment and the uh, desires of her coalition. That seems to really be what's shaping her views. She's not alone among politicians in that respect, obviously. Um, yeah, you saw in the 2008 campaign that George W. Bush ran against John Kerry less as a Massachusetts liberal than as a flip flopper. So I don't know if we'll see the return of that kind of language with Kamala. Uh, but I do think raising some of these issues, presenting her as someone who cares more about the billionaire class than about normal Americans, would be a very potent theme for Trump's campaign. And surely the selection of JD Vance should help them do that. Meanwhile, there's a dispute over election integrity and voter fraud, o- combined with unrest in the wake of an election. It's happening not in the United States, but in Venezuela. Uh, Geoff, what's going on?
So the election that was held on Sunday was, as Juan Rojas covered for us last week, was sort of widely seen as probably the Venezuelan opposition's best chance so far to unseat Nicolas Maduro, who's now been in power for over a decade, and is widely understood to be a dictator uh, who holds elections, but they are largely a sham. This election, most polling suggested that the opposition was winning somewhere around 2/3 of the vote, but Maduro claimed victory with 51% of the vote, and there's quite a bit of reasonable suspicion that there was rigging going on. It's worth noting as well that the main opposition candidates had been the best known opposition candidates had been disqualified from running prior to um, the election, and therefore the person who represented the opposition was a relatively obscure and unknown figure, but who had the endorsement of the most popular opposition figures. So it's a little difficult to tell. I mean, there have been previous disputed elections there where there was unrest. The unrest was largely squashed, and then the result, as we've seen in recent years, has just been a huge out out migration of people fleeing the country because of the both political repression, but more fundamentally, just the complete disaster of the Venezuelan economy, which is basically a oil dependent economy, but which is so mismanaged that it's despite the ostensible riches, it's basically been suffering from hyperinflation, food shortages, et cetera, for at least a decade. So it's quite a grim and depressing situation. I think the at this point, because of the huge outflows of migrants, it's become an issue of concern for neighboring countries because their own resources are being strained by the number of Venezuelans fleeing there. And obviously the US has been, right where I live in New York City, there's a large migrant shelter where there are a huge number of Venezuelans, and so it's having quite an impact on the entire region. So I think it'll be interesting to see. At this point, the government is claiming victory and refusing to offer any kind of recount or reassessment of the results. There's a considerable amount of international pressure, including from governments. And this was the subject of Juan's piece, that were previously seen as aligned with the Venezuelan government, including Colombia and Brazil, which are both left-leaning governments. So it's a little difficult to tell. I do think what you are seeing is a kind of increasing isolation, which seems like a significant development. And it's worth just revisiting the history briefly. So, the current regime has been in power for over 2 decades, initially led by Hugo Chavez. And I'll confess here that 2 decades or 15 years ago, I was sort of a defender of Chavez. If anyone sort of criticized him, and it's interesting to compare him to a figure like Viktor Orban today. I would argue, because he was kind of there were all these attempts to treat him as a pariah, as a somebody who was kind of on the outs with the international community, so called. And on one level, he seemed to kind of relish that role. And at the time, I think similarly to how a few things we've published might defend Orban's Hungary. There's all this talk of, or for that matter, AMLO in Mexico. There's all this talk of democratic backsliding and so on. I mean, at the time, it seemed clear to me that Chavez was essentially a popular leader because he used the country's oil wealth to create various social programs that improve people's standard of living. It wasn't really that hard to see why he would be reelected over and over again. Similarly to why I would say, Bukele in El Salvador. I mean, it makes complete sense that he would be wildly popular. But and here's the point. I think you did see an erosion of institutions under Chavez's rule that that kind of removed any way of really legitimately dislodging the ruling party. And then under Maduro, who's a much more sort of a much less charismatic figure overall, and a sort of much more willing to just to take blatant authoritarian. I think Chavez was always concerned to put his democratic legitimacy on display, and he held many referendums on various things that he wanted to do, and would invite international observers to verify the results and so on. So he was always concerned to put his the democratic source of his power on display. And Maduro, I think, has very little concern with that, and has been willing to just be far more blatantly authoritarian. At the same time, the total mismanagement of the economy and the problems that were introduced under Chavez have just been exacerbated and gotten worse. So I think in retrospect, I was probably too defensive of Chavez, but it is interesting, and I bring it up because there are these various figures who today, and I mentioned three, right, all of whom we've covered, who kind of represent an interesting political spectrum in and of themselves. But one would be AMLO, another would be Orban, and another would be Bukele, all of whom are accused of and described by the kind of mainstream international press in very similar terms to how Chavez was 20 years ago. Now, at the time, again, I was sort of defensive of Chavez. I thought he was unfairly maligned, and that the international media's general bias against him was reflective of its own kind of oligarchic alignment. And I will say, in retrospect, I think, while some of that coverage was not entirely fair, or was really exaggerated his dictatorial powers at the time. Nonetheless, it does make me slightly, having been somebody who has sort of criticized these uh, claims of democratic backsliding in these other contemporary cases I bring up. It makes me slightly question myself, because I did have that position 20 years ago, and I think there are some respects in which certainly the people warning about where the Chavez regime was going were vindicated by subsequent developments. So it's an interesting case. I don't know. My hope would be that there will be some sort of that the increasing isolation of the regime will lead to some kind of transition, because the country really is practically a failed state at this point, and it's hard to imagine how it will not keep getting worse with disastrous ramifications for the region, unless some sort of international pressure, including regimes like Brazil and Colombia, which are seen as not part of some kind of Western colonialist conspiracy, but seen as at least nominally ideologically sympathetic, but concerned about the state of a neighboring country, will have some kind of positive role to play. So I don't know. It could simply melt down into a kind of slow civil war. It could simply lead to further massive population loss as people flee the country. It looks potentially quite bleak unless there's some sort of uh, again, I think, sort of credible regional attempts to mediate an accord between the regime and the opposition. And as Juan wrote about, this would probably require some sort of amnesty for the current, the current people currently in charge, in order to give them an exit from power that will be amenable to them, and give them a reason not to simply cling on to power for as long as they can. So it's a concerning situation, and I think it is. Again, it makes me, because of my own sort of history of thinking about this, it makes me slightly question some of my own instincts and positions about other regimes today. So being slightly heretical to certain compact positions and positions I've taken by saying that, but always good to you know question one's own priors occasionally.
I mean, I'll just say, I think it's fair to be, aware of that. I mean, as is well known to my Twitter followers and people who listen to this podcast, I don't have this sort of deification of some right wing figures that others um, engage in. Certainly not Bukele, whom I've been publicly skeptical about, but in part because of the kinds of people who deify him. But I mean, like, I like to think that if Prime Minister Orban started like importing security agents from, let's say, the FSB, the way that the Chavez regime imports, uses the fearsome Cuban sort of spy apparatus to repress his own population, that I would say, okay, well, this is going in a very bad direction, and I'm off the train. Uh, hasn't happened yet. And speaking of people who, like, now, after all these years and the kind of constant underhanded election interference of the Venezuelan regime, or methods that it uses to win elections, and of course the repression, who are kind of gross third worldist apologists for it, worth calling out too. I only mention him. I mean, I think he's a kind of Twitter clown, but he's also been ranked among the top 10, maybe the top number one, at least for a while, Twitter or X account, and that's Jackson Hinkle, this kind of weird next generation leader of the LaRouche movement. I think that's a correct way to characterize him, leaning into a kind of whatever, what do they call it? MAGA communism, or communism. I can't, just straight up communism. He just launched an American Communist Party, which is unaffiliated from the historical, CPUSA, Communist Party USA. Photograph of himself. I don't even know if it's doctored, whether he's really walked alongside Maduro or not, but it's like, congratulations to the great leader of the Bolivarian revolution, Maduro. And then Vijay Prashad, who's actually a much more respectable figure of the global Southist left, making similar noises, just characterizing the entire opposition as a CIA quote unquote far right effort. And the shameful thing about that is not much notice is that the Maduro regime is at war with the actually existing Communist Party of Venezuela. Through its interference and underhanded methods, it has pushed the actual Venezuelan CP into the arms of the opposition. So just like little details that this kind of third worldist America can't ever do right. Anyone that opposes the United States must be automatically good. It requires you to make gross kind of compromises in terms of how you perceive reality, or whether you perceive reality.
Yeah, I think seeing the again, having a slight record of having defended the Chavez regime again 20 years ago when I was a raw youth, but nevertheless, seeing this kind of as you say, I mean, on one hand, these kind of online tanky figures like Hinkle, but also these sort of lefty third worldist academics who still today will will share. I saw a person who's a Verso published prominent academic post a meme that was like, your Venezuelan friend, Maduro has ruined the country. And then it's like a picture of the Venezuelan friend, and it's like a blonde, it's like basically a blonde, sort of Aryan looking guy. And it's like, this is just
and a wealthy guy. He's like,
yeah, exactly. And he's like wearing Gucci or whatever. Yeah, exactly. So it's I mean, it's disgusting because I've met, I mean, there's this huge shelter near where I live that's like full of Venezuelan families. I've talked to some of them. They don't look like that. And it's really a catastrophe what's going on there, and it's quite disgusting. Similarly to I suppose various other kinds of regime apologists, but it is quite disgusting to see kind of people with tenure in Europe and the U.S. Kind of ridiculing the opponents of the regime there. It's quite horrifying. So
Not much to add. I'll just say it's striking. Earlier, as Geoff noted, that we've seen the failure of two approaches to Venezuela under the Trump regime. There was an effort to prop up Juan Guaido, if that's how it's pronounced, and this became a kind of farce where you had a guy living overseas, controlling a bunch of the country's assets, uh, and so that tough-minded approach kind of just became ridiculous and unsustainable. But the kind of softening of his stance toward Venezuela that's been attempted under Biden has equally failed. So we're going to need more intelligent approach, and will Kamala or Trump 2 term differ from Biden and Trump 1 respectively? One hopes so, and I guess we'll have to see. Back to the election. Since Kamala was endorsed by Biden as the next Democratic presidential nominee, we've seen a range of Zoom calls with members of various racial and sexual affinity groups. Black women for Harris. We saw white women for Kamala, or Karens for Kamala. According to a report in the New York Times, the author Glennon Doyle on the call urged women to get engaged in political organizing and tearfully described conversations with her therapist and her sister about her fear of getting canceled if she says the wrong thing. Spoiler alert, Miss Doyle told the call, if we stay quiet and don't fight, we are all getting mass canceled on January 20, 2025. And then this process culminated in the great and famous white dudes for Kamala call. The actor Jeff Bridges appeared, conferring a kind of apostolic dudeness on the proceedings. Uh, Pete Buttigieg appeared after him, uh, saying, "The vibes right now are incredible. What's really filling my sails right now," he said, "is Miss Harris's focus on positive things, particularly freedom." Adam Schiff also appeared with his Big Lebowski dude bobblehead. Uh, did any of you make the call?
I did not had some other business to attend to, but it's yeah, it's I'm I'm trying to I think one, I'm going to draw a silver lining out of this, which is, maybe making white identity politics cringe is a positive development. Um and I will say, on one, I'm trying to read it. I'm trying to read it in relation to, the 2020 moment, and it seems to me, on one hand, you have this kind of continuity with, sort of the 2010s era rise of this, notion of sort of allyship, and you have to you know um, you have to sort of get in line to support the elevation of those who have historically been more marginalized than you, and sort of be um, be a good ally to the members of those groups, and so on. And so, we're very familiar with that. I mean, it does seem like the mood and vibe of this is quite different, and it's actually, I was wondering about this, that it seems to me in 2020, I mean, maybe you have had this reaction, and I just haven't seen it, but it seems to me in 2020 or 2016, um, you might have had a huge backlash to these gatherings, that they would have been seen as toxic, within the kind of social justice minded left-leaning world, and there would have been a kind of circular, typical sort of circular firing squad meltdown, where eventually the organizers of this call would have been forced to, do a kind of show trial, confession of their sins, and renounce the entire enterprise. So, maybe there are people denouncing it. I'm not sure. I haven't noticed, but it does strike me that it seems like a slightly different mood, um, where that this kind of jokey invocation of a kind of identity category, specifically around the sort of Big Lebowski references and so on, is like, there's to me, it seems like further evidence that, while there's a kind of continuity, the sheer kind of, and this I think would go along with Musa Al-Gharbi's analysis, that, the sheer kind of moral fervor has died down. And so even though the same kind of patterns are playing out, there's less of a kind of fervent sort of tent revival spirit to it all, and it's kind of more mellow and jokey. At least that's sort of the way that I'm reading this. But then, my silver lining again is that, maybe if you make white male identity politics cringe and identify it with, the cringest possible figures, then maybe that reduces its appeal among sort of among people for whom it has been appealing up to now. So that's maybe the sort of unintentional mimetic effect of this. Uh, but who knows? One can hope.
I won't say much other than, I tweeted this thing, or I said, it's a reversion to the worst kind of laptop class self-flagellation, but it's actually the subtext is self-congratulations. That look how good I am compared to these other white people. And the stuff they say is the same kind of language that I maybe I was naive. Maybe a lot of people who thought this stuff was going away were naive, but maybe it's the election brings it out. But I was watching footage of both the male one and the female one, and I won't say which one's more insufferable, but there a lot of this sort of uh, BIPOC people, are have tapped us in, white folks. We have to step in for our BIPOC, and et cetera, et cetera. And Matt Sitman of the Know Your Enemy podcast and of the Dissent magazine editorial board, who I think knows that this stuff is insufferable, um, and wants something else from the actually existing left, replies to me, on Twitter, says, "Well, it's this time the joke is built in. This time it's ironic. Everyone knows that they don't really mean it." I don't really. I see no evidence of that. These people were maybe except the Jeff Bridges, the dude. I don't know, but everyone else was super earnest, and including the sort of lots of people being like, because you can watch footage of it online, there's so much whiteness here, and whiteness is a code for something bad anyway. It it seemed to me pretty damn earnest. Like I don't get, unless it's it's this one large project involving thousands of people who are actually out to mock their own politics. It's pretty earnest. When you say BIPOC women of color, blah, 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 have tapped us in, white folks, it's time for us to step up. If you don't mean that, if you mean it ironically, then you must be, according to the logic of this type of politics, you are a really bad person. You're mocking allyship. And I don't think these people are doing that. So please don't gaslight us, Mr. Sitman, by saying that this stuff, it's just irony. They're just joking about it. Then why frame it that way? Like, what a bizarre, I just, maybe I'm too cynical, or maybe I'm too naive. I don't know which is which, but this stuff seemed pretty straightforward and earnest to me. I just putting it out there.
So am I gaslighting as well? With my more, my more forgiving assessment of it. No, I mean I think, well, I mean the whole question of what's earnest and what's, it is of course always a difficult one in the internet age. But yeah, I mean I agree that as I said, there's a lot that's just sort of um, astonishingly and overwhelmingly cringe about this whole phenomenon. But I guess the question I raised, which I'm not sure about, is, it seems that and obviously there is that still kind of fervency in it, but it just does seem to me that maybe if you had tried to do this 4 or 8 years ago, it would have led to huge recriminations and meltdowns. And that doesn't seem to be happening. So that does suggest to me some sort of vibe shift, ever so subtle, which, whether that's good or not, I don't know. But it does, I think, to me, confirm some kind of sense of like, there's even though the language and the kind of orientation is the same, there's a certain kind of mellowing away from the really, fanatical fervency of an earlier time. I don't know. But
yeah, the
you got to read the news release that set up the meeting. It's we as white men know that the Trump movement wants to use us to hurt BIPOC people.
Yeah.
If you don't mean that, then if they don't mean that, I don't know. I'm sorry to interrupt, Matthew.
Yeah, it's one of these things where you see, the racial politics we have. Race is treated as the master key, but it is understood in political terms. So if you're a white guy through allyship, you can get on the right side of the racial divide. And if you're a person of color, you can, through adjacency, white adjacency, uh, end up on the bad side of this racial divide. So, we're seeing white dudes for Harris. Maybe it reflects a certain uh, anxiety about whether black dudes will really turn out for Harris. Um, so I think an important element of this, along with the race, is just the kind of rise of a sexual politics, of sexual polarization, which seems to be coming to America hard and fast. All right, with that, thanks, Geoff, Sohrab, and thanks to our listeners. Go to compactmag.com/subscribe to read everything we publish.